I'm Nathan Rutherford, and welcome to Myth Madness. Last time on the pod, I talked about Apollo. I went over how Apollo was another of Zeus's illegitimate children, and how his mother Leto had a lot of difficulty in trying to find a place to give birth to her son. A lot of different locations have personalities in this myth, and they seemed afraid of being the birthplace of Apollo, either because they were scared of how powerful Apollo would be after he was born, or because Hera, the good old real wife of Zeus, was already making Leto's life difficult, and would probably make things worse for the birthplace as well. Eventually, though, the island of Delos was persuaded by Leto to be Apollo's birthplace. But I purposely left out emphasis on something. Apollo was not Leto's only infant child. He had a sister, a twin sister in fact, named Artemis. There are, of course, differing accounts of the births of Apollo and Artemis. In the Theogony, Hesiod lists Leto as a partner of Zeus before he is married to Hera, but the Homeric hymns that relate to their births suggest Hera is annoyed with Leto and tried to make her birth difficult, actions which sound like a wife trying to punish her husband's mistress. Of course, it could also be the actions of a jealous lover in a kind of weird three-way love triangle. So let's call these two versions the jealous lover and the angry wife. Hesiod's order of Zeus's partners is unusual, though. The dominant tradition is that Artemis and Apollo are the product of Zeus's affair with Leto. In the later Hellenistic period, there lived a Greek poet and scholar named Callimachus. He lived from 310 BC to 240 BC, and he wrote books and a lot of hymns, and a few of which are about Artemis. Callimachus picked up from the angry wife tradition seen in the Homeric hymns. The myths he wrote down say that Leto had a hard time finding a birthplace for her children because Hera had forbid her from giving birth on the Greek mainland. In different sources, though, such as Homeric hymn number 3, Apollo and Artemis may be born in different places, with Artemis being said to be born on Ortygia. Today, we know Ortygia as an island near Sicily, but according to some ancient Greek writers, Ortygia was actually just another name for Delos, so maybe Artemis and Apollo were not actually born in different places at all. And sometimes the order of who was born is different too. Sometimes Apollo is first, and sometimes Artemis is the older one. When Artemis is the older one, she sometimes aids her mother Leto in giving birth to Apollo, such as in Apollodorus' library. In the myth I told last episode, Artemis isn't featured, and the goddess of childbirth, Aletheia, helps Leto. Leaving the birth aside, though, Callimachus tells several stories of Artemis's childhood in one of his poems. One time, when she was a little girl, Artemis was sitting on the knees of her father Zeus. She asks her father to grant her several wishes, and he agrees. She wishes to always remain a virgin, to have many names and epithets that set her apart from her twin brother Apollo. She asks him to have the Cyclopses, the same ones who make Zeus's lightning bolts, create for her a bow and arrows. Artemis asks for the title Thesphoria, which means bringer of light. She also wants a short tunic that only reaches her knees, so that she will be unencumbered and able to hunt and slay wild beasts whenever she wants. She asks for 2 groups of companions. One group consisted of 60 Oceanids, the daughters of the Titan Oceanus. All of these young girls were 9 years old, and they would be Artemis's personal choir. The other group are 20 nymphs of the Amnisos River in Crete, and they will serve as Artemis's handmaidens, who will look after Artemis's clothes and her hunting dogs when she is resting. Artemis also asks to rule over the mountains, and tells Zeus that she can be given any city he wants, because she doesn't really intend on visiting the cities of men often anyway. And finally, if that wasn't all enough, Artemis tells Zeus that when she was born, the 3 fates decreed that she could be the helper of those women in childbirth, and that she will only go to the cities in order to do so. With these wishes, the girl Artemis then reached up and tried to touch Zeus's beard several times. This made Zeus smile, and he bowed his head and gave Artemis a big hug. Zeus then says, "When goddesses bear me children like this, little need I heed the wrath of jealous Hera." He promises Artemis these things that she has asked for, and then says he will give her even more. It's a nice myth moment. I especially like it because it seems to show a different side of Zeus that we don't normally get in the Greek myths. Zeus is often presented to us today as a pretty terrible person. In a lot of the stories, he's a rapist, and generally, like a lot of the other gods, a fickle psychopath. But in the ancient Greek religion, Zeus is the Sky Father, and in this scene, with Artemis, we get less of Zeus as the ruthless king of the universe, and more as a benevolent father figure. Now, even though Artemis asks for all these things, though, and Zeus will grant them, they don't just poof out of the air like she gave wishes to a genie. Instead, Artemis actually has to now physically go and get them. First, Artemis goes to the island of Crete, traveling to the wild places there with their white mountains and thick, leafy forests. There she finds her first 20 nymphs. Then she goes to Aeschines and Tethys and chooses 60 of their 9-year-old daughters. The old Titan couple is so happy that their daughters are joining the retinue of the daughter of Zeus, and so they agree to give them to her. From there, Artemis packs up her squad and goes to another island. This time, it's the island of Lipara, also called Meligunus. This island is between Sicily and Italy, and here is located the forge and anvils of the smith god Hephaestus. And it is a very busy place. The Cyclopses are hard at work at the anvils of Hephaestus, working on a huge mass of molten iron. They were building a great trough to be used by the horses belonging to Zeus's brother Poseidon. The Cyclopses, with their huge single eyes, were banging loudly at the anvils and working the forge's bellows. Artemis's followers were intimidated by the giants and the forge and could not face the Cyclopses. Artemis, however, was not intimidated. When she was 3 years old, Leto had brought her here before, so Hephaestus could give her gifts. At that time, the baby Artemis had sat on the knees of the Cyclops Brontes and pulled the hair off his chest. Even as a baby, Artemis was fearless. So this time, Artemis bravely approaches and asks for a bow, arrows, and a quiver to hold the arrows. Once the Cyclopses finish, Artemis took her entourage to Arcadia in Greece. She travels deep into the mountains and finds the god Pan as he cuts up the body of a dead lynx to feed his dogs. Pan gives Artemis several hunting dogs, 2 black and white ones, 3 reddish-brown, and 1 with spots. They were fierce dogs and perfectly able to hunt lions. He also gave her 7 female dogs that ran swifter than the wind, perfect for hunting fawns, young deer, rabbits, stag, porcupine, and gazelle. With her followers, bow and arrows, and hunting dogs, Artemis is now ready to hunt. Still in Arcadia, she finds a herd of 5 deer. But these aren't any old deer. They are larger than bulls, and their horns were made of gold. Artemis herself is able to run 4 of the deer down on foot and capture them. However, Hera intervened to spare the 5th deer and let it escape over a river. That deer would later be hunted by the Greek hero Heracles, but at that time it got across the river and hid in a place called Chaeronea. Artemis did not kill the 4 deer she captured. Instead, she gets them to pull her chariot. Callimachus also gives us a glimpse of Artemis's arrival on Mount Olympus. She arrives at the house of Zeus and is greeted by her brother Apollo and her half-brother Hermes. Hermes takes Artemis's weapons, and Apollo takes the slain wild beasts that Artemis brings. Artemis's nymph companions rub down the deer that pull her chariot and set them loose to rest. The deer drink the mead, a fermented honey drink, of Hera, and eat clover with the horses of Zeus. The gods fill golden troughs with water for the animals to drink. In the house of her father, Artemis takes a seat with the other gods, sitting next to her twin brother Apollo. So, Artemis is kind of what we call today a tomboy. A Homeric hymn dedicated to Aphrodite says that Artemis loves archery, hunting beasts in the mountains, but also listening to the lyre and dancing with her entourage. The name Artemis definitely goes back to the Mycenaean Greek times, but no one is really sure what it means. It may have something to do with bears, which were sacred to Artemis. At her core, Artemis is the goddess of wild places and wild animals. Homer in the Iliad calls her Potnia Theron, and this was a common epithet or title for her. It means lady of animals. And the word Potnia, which means lady, is regularly used in the examples of Mycenaean Greek text that we have that refer to goddesses. So Artemis seems to be a particularly ancient Greek goddess, going right to the beginning of Greek civilization. In fact, she, or at least a goddess who is closely linked to hunting animals, may be even older than that. Some scholars think that a similar goddess to Artemis was worshipped by the Minoans. The Minoans were a people based in Crete, and their civilization existed before and also at the same time as Mycenaean Greece. The earliest evidence of Minoan culture dates back to around 3500 BC. Theirs was a sophisticated culture, with elaborate palaces that even had a form of plumbing. The Minoans even traded with ancient Egypt during the heyday of their civilization, but began a slow decline around 1550 BC, before finally disappearing in 1100 BC. Besides being the Mistress of Animals, and I mean a goddess that seems to enjoy camping in the mountains with her girlfriends and hunting animals, Artemis's other main feature in Greek mythology is that she is a virgin, sworn to remain so and never have any kind of intimacy with a man. And there are a lot of myths in which Artemis protects that part of herself, often very strongly, and also favors it in others. In one myth, the river spirit Alpheus lusts after Artemis, but because he realizes she won't return his feelings, he decides to kidnap her. To escape him, Artemis covers her face and the faces of her nymphs with mud. Alpheus is unable to tell them apart, and so leaves them alone. More famous, though, is the myth involving Actaeon. There are several sources for this myth, and they range from a play by Greek playwright Aeschylus, writing around 500 BC, Callimachus again, Apollodorus' library, the Roman poet Ovid, and a few others from the Roman period. So we have sources from a wide spectrum of ancient Greek history. All these sources generally follow the same story. Actaeon is the son of Autonoe and Aristeos, and he is a skilled huntsman. Out on a hunt with his dogs one day, he comes across the goddess Artemis and her nymphs bathing in a freshwater spring deep in the woods. This shocks the nymphs, and they all start screaming and gathering around Artemis, who, as a goddess, is much taller than them. Embarrassed at being seen naked, Artemis turns around to reach for her arrows, but can't find them. So she splashes Actaeon with water, and he begins to turn into a stag, a male deer. His hands turn to hooves, his arms and legs lengthen, he grows fur all over his body, and antlers sprout from his head. Confused when he sees himself in the waters of the spring, he bounds away. Unfortunately, his own dogs smell his scent, now the scent of a deer, and chase after him, and eventually tear him to shreds. The usual story is that it wasn't necessarily Actaeon's fault, but seeing Artemis was still a crime against nature, and so he was punished for that. But there are sources that also say he desired to rape Artemis, or pursued her romantically when she wouldn't have him, or even claimed to be a better hunter than her. Regardless, though, the ancient Greeks considered Artemis justified. Another myth, one I find more interesting, involves Artemis's relationship with a giant named Orion. Who was Orion? According to one of Hesiod's lost works that we have quotes of, Orion was the son of Poseidon and a human princess named Euryale, and that Poseidon gave him the power to walk on water. In the first version of this myth, Orion is the lover of Eos, the goddess of the dawn, and she takes him to Ortygia or Delos, where Artemis kills him. Homer says Artemis killed him because the other Olympians were jealous of Eos taking a mortal as a lover. Apollodorus' library says that while in Delos, Orion either challenged Artemis to a discus match, and she killed him for his arrogance, or because he tried to force himself on either a virgin girl or Artemis herself. This seems like the typical man foolishly tried to seduce Artemis and pays for it kind of story. I think the other two versions are the more interesting ones. In version 2, Orion goes to Crete and becomes a favored hunting companion of Artemis and her mother Leto. He boldly claims that he could slay any beast the earth produced, and so Gaia, the Earth Mother, is offended at this and sends a giant scorpion to fight Orion. He is stung by the scorpion and dies. Artemis asks Zeus to put him in the sky, and he does so, making the constellation of Orion. Since this version is supposedly originally from Hesiod, it is at least as old as 800 BC, making it just as old as the first version of the myth. But then there is version 3. This one is told by a Roman we call Pseudo-Hyginus, who lived sometime in the 200s AD, so in the late Roman period. He does, however, quote a poet from Alexandria named Istrus, who lived in the early Hellenistic period of ancient Greece. This Istrus was apparently the apprentice of Callimachus, the guy who wrote the hymn I talked about earlier in the episode. Apparently he picked up his master's affinity for the hunting goddess, as he has something very intriguing to say about Artemis. His version of the myth is that Orion was not just a hunting companion for Artemis. Instead, Artemis actually loved Orion and almost decided to marry him. Her brother Apollo heard about this and, well, threw a fit, reminding her of her vows to remain a virgin. But Artemis could not be convinced, so Apollo pointed at something black far out to sea and made a bet with her that she could not hit it with her arrows. Well, she hit it, and sadly for Artemis, the black object was Orion swimming in the sea. Her arrow went through his head, and his dead body washed ashore. It's a tragic story, and I like it for the nuance it adds to the rest of the Artemis myths. Versions 2 and 3 give us an interesting example of a man who Artemis had at least some form of affection for. Unlike with many male hunters that get on Artemis's bad side, she is usually nice towards women. There are plenty of examples of her inviting virgins to join her hunting parties, and there are also examples of women dying as virgins and then being made immortal by Artemis so they can join her group. Sometimes, though, Artemis gives these women gifts, usually magic hunting dogs. 3 Roman period sources refer to the myth of Procris. One day, Procris discovered her husband was having an affair with Eos, the goddess of the dawn. This is not the first time we've heard about Eos, and it won't be the last. Rosy-fingered Eos is a bit boy-crazy. She could give Zeus a run for his money with her number of affairs with mortals. Anyway, heartbroken Procris packs up and heads to Crete where she finds Artemis. The goddess tells her that she allows only virgins to hunt with her, and since Procris was married, and definitely not a virgin, Artemis says she must leave. But Procris begs the goddess, and tells her about her husband. Artemis pities Procris and gives her a javelin, a kind of throwing spear, that will never miss a target, and a hunting dog that no animal can ever escape. So Artemis only allows virgin women to hunt with her, but at least in the case of Procris, was willing to help her out. But what happens if one of Artemis's companions stops being a virgin? What then? Well, Callisto was a princess who lived in Arcadia in southern Greece. She went to the mountains and joined Artemis in her hunting, swearing the usual oath that she would remain a virgin. Artemis came to be very fond of her, but when Zeus appeared, he either seduced Callisto or tricked her into sleeping with him by taking the form of Artemis herself. Callisto became pregnant, and for a time tried to hide it from Artemis. But eventually, when they were bathing, Artemis noticed that Callisto was pregnant, and angry about her broken oath, turned her into a bear. This story is first found in a fragment of a book by Hesiod, taking us back to about 700 BC. But guess what? There is another tradition for this myth. From around the same time period, we also have a source saying that Artemis shot Callisto while she was in bear form with an arrow from her silver bow. So does that mean that after Artemis found out about Callisto's pregnancy, she was so angry she turned her into a bear and then shot her? Kind of sounds a bit, overkill, doesn't it? Well, later sources explain that by saying that it was not Artemis that turned Callisto into a bear. They say that after Callisto slept with Zeus, either Zeus or Hera turned her into a bear. So how did Callisto die then? These texts blame Hera for tricking Artemis into killing her old companion. But either way, know this. Artemis only wants virgins to join her hunting party, and they have to remain so. If not, and they break their oath, there are consequences. Leaving the myths for now, I want to take some time to talk about how the ancient Greeks worshipped Artemis. Earlier in this episode, I mentioned how one of Artemis's wishes to Zeus was that she should have multiple epithets and names, just like her brother Apollo. And well, in practice, Artemis had plenty. I've already talked about one of her main ones, Potnia Theron, Mistress of Animals, or Queen of Beasts. But Artemis had many, many more, and some of them refer to her association with hunting and wilderness. Translated into English, she is called Artemis of the Hunt, Artemis of the Deer. Others refer to trees, laurel trees, cedars, walnut trees. But Artemis is also called Nurse of Children, Friend of Young Girls, Helper of Childbirth. There are also others that are common in the Iliad, Odyssey, and Homeric hymns. Things like Far Shooting, Worker from Afar, and Of Showering Arrows, all referring to Artemis's skills with the bow. Then there is Of the Golden Reins, referring to Artemis's chariot being pulled by deer. I like one in particular, Keleine, which means Lady of Clamors. Then there were a whole bunch referring to different geographic locations, referring to her cults local to those areas. Artemis was worshipped all across ancient Greece, but she had a major cult on Delos, alongside Apollo, and specific temples in Attica, Central Greece, and in Sparta. Artemis also had a number of festivals dedicated exclusively to her throughout ancient Greece. But Artemis also had a major center of worship in Ephesus, on what is now the coast of Turkey. And here there was the site of a major temple to Artemis. This temple was first built in the early years of Greek civilization, but was destroyed by a flood in the 600s BC. It was rebuilt in 550 BC, and was so spectacular it was considered one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. Unfortunately, about 200 years later, it burned down in an act of arson. Worship of Artemis in Ephesus was more unique than anywhere else in the Greek world. There was a cult statue of Artemis that was kept decorated with jewelry. This statue was made of wood, and it did not actually look like your typical Greek statues that you might find in a museum today. Its artistic style was more similar to statues from earlier periods found in the Middle East and Egypt. It's likely that before the archaic Greeks colonized this area, the cult at Ephesus was originally dedicated to a goddess that was not Artemis, but that they identified their own goddess with the site when they got there. Another shift in the worship of Artemis occurred in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. As I mentioned in the last episode, Apollo eventually became more of a sun god, replacing Helios as the driver of the sun chariot. A similar thing happened with his sister Artemis. Over time, she replaced the Titan Selene as the main moon goddess. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Artemis was a very important Greek goddess and associated with archery, the wilderness, and virginity. Over time, Artemis gained responsibilities over childbirth, and there are myths showing her as a midwife at the birth of her brother Apollo. And later, she became the goddess of the moon as well. Artemis had a huge number of myths involving her, or her hunting party, encountering male hunters in the woods. I actually found a whole bunch I was unfamiliar with when I was doing research for this episode, but for the sake of time I stuck with the ones that I thought were the most interesting. Maybe I'll come back to Artemis in a future episode, but for now, I'll move on next week with the next Olympian. If you're enjoying this podcast, get the word out and tell your friends. You can follow the pod on Instagram and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. Thank you for listening.